Welcome to Table Talk, the place for deep conversations in the Geekverse. And trust me, when we tear into a subject, we go deep. I'm Heath, and I'll be your host. Each episode, I'll be talking with one or more creators, authors, illustrators, publishers, or other movers and shakers in games, TV, books, movies, or other areas of the Geekverse. Regular guests include Douglas A. Burton, the author of Faraway Bird, a multi-award-winning historical fiction novel of the Byzantine Empress Theodora. He's also the author of The Heroine's Labyrinth, an alternative story structure to the hero's journey that often occurs in stories with feminine heroes. That structural framework frequently comes up in our analysis of story. Brianna De Silva, she's the director and co-writer of The Cultists, a Lovecraftian comedy mockumentary-style web show here on YouTube, and the author of The City of Reckoning, an epic fantasy novel of political intrigue, the ethics of war, and young love. Cameron Pasha is a screenwriter, director, novelist, and was a writer and producer on the series Kings, a producer on NBC's Bionic Woman, and a co-producer and writer for Sleeper Cell. He's also written for the CW series Nikita and Roswell, New Mexico. He's been breaking news from inside Lucasfilm, Disney, and Hollywood. His analysis and commentary have become very popular on YouTube. We regularly meet to discuss and analyze stories, and when we do, we dive into graduate-level seminars on story structure and writing. Come on in and let's go deep. And when I say we're going deep, I mean you'd better bring your hard suit. Other guests have included Lou Anders, the author of the Thrones and Bones fantasy novels Once Upon a Unicorn, the creator and publisher of the Norengard RPG, and the author of Star Wars: A Pirate's Price, the book that explains why the Millennium Falcon is on the planet Batu at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Mark Tassin, the creator of the World of Ataltis, head of Mechanical Muse, former director of the Gen Con Writers Symposium, and the head developer of the new Cool Name RPG. Let's see, who else?
Bond. James Bond.
Well, not James Bond. Not yet. Maybe soon, though. But I have interviewed Jamie Stegmaier, the founder of Stonemaier Games, crowdfunder extraordinaire, and publisher of many hit board games like Scythe and Wingspan. Brian Colin, sculptor of the world of Revelo Monster Busts, and the creator of the vast grim dark horror RPG. Ajit George, the Dungeons & Dragons author. We talked about game writing, education, and his contribution to Van Richter's Guide to Ravenloft, and the development of the Journeys to the Radiant Citadel.
I am Hela, Odin's firstborn, commander of the legions of Asgard, the rightful heir to the throne, and the goddess of death.
Well, actually, that interview got rather spicy, so I think I'd better just keep that one to myself. Kate Wilson, a YouTuber, actress, host, and prolific geek guru who's now working to make a new show dedicated to the world of tabletop gaming a reality. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride, because it's time to explore the worlds of tabletop gaming, sci-fi, fantasy, and all of geekdom through the eyes of those who are making things happen.
Atomic batteries to power. Turbines to speed.
Roger, ready to move out.
It's time for Table Talk. Hey everyone! Good evening and welcome. I know that we are seriously late tonight, like 24 minutes late getting started. That's my fault. I was really late getting here and getting in and sitting down, but then I also wanted to talk to James Bacon, who is our guest tonight, about some of the things about structuring this conversation and sending him some videos and things like that. So we were having some back and forth before all of this started, and so it's my fault. I was late and then we were getting started. But we're here now, and thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to my home, welcome to the office, and welcome to Table Talk. Tonight, we are going to be talking about The Hobbit, specifically the movie adaptions. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. We're more about that in just a moment. I was going to talk about The Hobbit. The Hobbit has an extremely special place in my heart, which we'll talk more about in a moment as well. And we are going to talk about The Hobbit from a literary perspective in the book here on this show. I guess it will probably be now next year, 2025. And I was going to completely pass over the theatrical adaptation, the movie adaptions. But someone who is very special to this channel, an important part of this channel, was talking to me about how much he enjoyed these films and wanted to talk about them. And so I was like, hey, actually, now is a fantastic time to do that. So I'd like to welcome James Bacon on the channel.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, so thank you so much for coming on tonight. I think this is going to be a good conversation because otherwise, like I said, this would have been something that I probably would have skipped. But you said that, that this was an important conversation. You had things to say. And so it's important to do it then.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation where, first of all, thank you as always for having me on. I enjoy coming on and talking about these things with you. It's always a really good time to explore these ideas and reactions and whatnot. And I will say that this is definitely a case of me being able to forgive a lot, and I will be honest in my assessment of the film, because I say the film, it's really a trilogy. There's a lot that it does wrong, right? There's a lot that people do not like for really good reason. And I think that there's a lot to explore. I think there are reasons for that we'll get into later. But yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about this. It's also, I guess, a lot of my love for the films comes from baggage. I think I've told you this. There's a lot of baggage that I bring with me for any given movie. And usually I can have a very high opinion of a film, even if it's not a great movie, if the stars were right when I went to go see it at the theater, or who I was seeing it with, or who introduced me to it, or what the situation was, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of that, and we can get into that later when we actually get into the film and why I like it and why I'm able to forgive it for so much. But Doc Flamingo says, "Don't sell the Hobbit short. It did everything wrong." It did quite a bit wrong. That is for sure. It did
I think so, and that's why I was gonna kind of skip it. We have Jason 96 here. Welcome.
Hey, Jason.
Sable Phoenix, the Titter Pig Rancher, is here. I just saw Robert came in.
Robert.
Robert says James just back from mining. I love it. Doc Flamingo is here, as you just said.
Doc.
So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Look, I want to bring up just like I said, I'm behind on everything because I'm completely scatterbrained because I came in so late and sitting down here. But here is your channel.
Oh yeah, I do have one of those, don't I?
Yes. So I will let me put your link in the chat.
ABGD.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the Better with Bacon channel. I talk about movies and RPGs, a lot of what Heath discusses. In fact, Heath was the grand inspiration for my actually getting started with doing the channel. We like to have live conversations and streams. I put up individual videos on some of my thoughts and musings regarding role-playing games. Mostly are the solo videos, though I will probably be planning a couple on film in December specifically. I have a whole month planned out. Who knows if I'll get to everything, but that is the plan for sure. So yeah, we did Arcane recently. It was me and Sable Phoenix, the Titter Pig Rancher. We've done other films. We've done role-playing topics. It's been quite fun. So I'm a pretty small channel, but I'd like to think big ideas. I try to talk about things in new ways. And I'd love to have you.
All right. Yes, absolutely. Please sub to his channel if you are here with us. Okay. All right. So we were talking about some different ways to approach this. And the thing that I think I would say first. So let's start with this first. Well, okay, let me actually even start before that. Let me say that The Hobbit, like the reason that I really want to cover The Hobbit, and I want to cover The Hobbit from the literary perspective, is because The Hobbit is probably one of the reasons why I am everything that I am today. I have an Uncle Robert, who is a huge fantasy, Lord of the Rings fan, all of that. He was a major contributor to my life and like providing me all the fantasies elements, and I remember actually getting The Hobbit from him. And actually, it's this book right over here. It's actually this book. So it's the one with Tolkien's art in it right here. I mean, this is actually the book that he lent me at the time, and then I guess I got it back because I still have it.
That's my favorite cover art for The Hobbit.
Yeah. This is the book that I got before I was actually old enough to read it. And I'm sure I'll tell the story again when we actually talk about the book itself. But I mean, he lived next door to me. And so I remember him talking to me about a book that he read about a dragon that the gold he had laid on the gold for so long that it stuck to him and all that. And he was actually demonstrating, like, hey, like he was putting his hand on a rock, like, so we were outside, like, how it was showing me how, like, the rock stuck to him, and he was like, this is how the gold stuck to him and stuff like that. And so he let me borrow this book before I was really old enough to read it for myself. And that's how we kind of established a family tradition that my mother read this to me. So when you're old enough to understand a chapter book, but probably not read it yourself, however old that is, that's when I got this. My mother read me this book as a bedtime story, like actually this exact physical book, and I still remember. I remember all of the imagery that was in my mind as she was reading it to me. And I really think that's incredible that, decades and decades later, the same images that, came into my mind as she was reading it still are in my mind. And so probably this book, and I actually mean this physical book, are the reasons why I love fantasy today. And so The Hobbit has an extremely important place in my heart. And that's why I really wanted to see it done well on film, if it was going to be done on film.
I, unfortunately, don't have that same experience. I didn't read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings until I was in my 20s.
Oh.
And it was brought to me from a friend who had a similar story to yours. His father had the book. He went through it and read it. He actually did every book report in high school that he could get away with doing on Lord of the Rings. He would do on Lord of the Rings. He did a very large reports and write-ups on the meanings of the different languages used and the different, just the different symbolism and whatnot. And he was really the one who convinced me to read it. Likewise, I didn't have any Star Wars exposure until I was in middle school, and because my father and my mother just weren't sci-fi fantasy people. So, there was a teacher, Mr. Dargay, who he was a science teacher, and I don't know if he got permission to do it or if he just did it, but for about, I would say, 3 weeks out of a year, he would run the Star Wars trilogy in his class for all of his students, just to sort of get them exposed to Star Wars, because he loved it so much. And because I guess he was aware as a teacher that not everyone had the exposure that he did as a kid. And so he was just introducing as many people as he could to it. So I didn't grow up with The Hobbit. Now, there was the Rankin and Bass animation that I did grow up with. So I knew The Hobbit from the animation, but it wasn't from reading it, and it definitely was not from that early of an age. But I did love it. I would say that, can I say it's formative because I wasn't really exposed to it as a kid all that much? I don't know. I wish I did, but it came to me all the same. And, we both share a love for it. I definitely threw myself into Tolkien and into learning about what his opinions were on his work, and the different letters that he wrote, and the world building that he did, and all the stuff that's external to the stories that he did just to kind of keep things straight in his own mind. I do love it quite a bit. I just don't have that same youthful experience.
And I'm sure that influences what you would do with it for an adaptation. Like, when you encounter it, what your experience with it is, I am sure that's part of it, which is kind of the next step that I'm sure I'll tell that story again when we actually talk about it from the literary perspective, but from the film perspective, then, okay, what do you do with this book? And so that was our basic, our first step in this. So if somebody says, excuse me, let's make a movie about the Hobbit, what do you do with it? And I bet that your answer to that is different than my answer because of our different relationships with the book in youth.
Probably. My answer, a very quick, very simple, probably very basic, maybe unsurprising, very boring answer is animation. I loved the Rankin and Bass animation, as unbelievably cheesy as it is in points. It is, I even behind the scenes, before we started this and we were discussing how we were going to, we were discussing the discussion. I said that The Hobbit comes in at a tight 90 minutes. I was wrong. It's a tight 80 minutes. It's 78 minutes long. Wow. And they hit absolutely every major beat because Bilbo is the main character, but it's really about how the ring came into Frodo's possession, right? Like it's the kickoff. It's just what kind of happened beforehand to launch Lord of the Rings from the platform that it launched from. And so, but man, is it a really tight 80 minutes, and it hits everything, and it does things that the movie, the live action films, the Peter Jackson films do not do, and they probably should have. I would say animation
does things that Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings does that they should have.
I'm sorry, The Hobbit should have done. That Peter Jackson's Hobbit should have done. Like, for example, there are 13 dwarves in the Rankin and Bass animation, but they're very rarely all on screen at the same time.
Right. Okay.
In Peter Jackson's films, they're always on screen at the same time, and you catch yourself wondering, who the hell is that? What's his name again? Like it's just one of those things that kind of, it's a little overbearing to see in the way that Peter Jackson did it.
Okay. Here's what I would think. Here's where I would go, and I see different divisions with the adaptation of this book that we could go with.
Okay.
Because, like I said, my first experience with this was as a very young child, when you can understand a chapter book, but probably not read it yourself. I don't remember. I wish I knew exactly when, but I'm thinking first grade. I'm thinking it was probably about first grade when my mother read this to me. So I'm thinking about that. So that's my first encounter with this. So if somebody came to me or somebody was talking in general about, okay, let's do an adaptation of The Hobbit, I can immediately see a fork in two different ways to adapt this, because somebody is going to say, and both of these are valid. I mean, both of these are valid potential forks, but somebody's going to say, this is a children's book. So what we need to do is we need to put on, and it's a lot of people's first encounter with fantasy in a novel form. So what we need to do is we need to take that idea, first encounter with fantasy, and adapt it to a film, so that just like you could hand, a young child like me The Hobbit and get them interested in fantasy, that you could take them to the movie theater and watch The Hobbit and get them invested in fantasy. So I can see that approach. This is going to be a fantasy film. It's going to be a children's fantasy film. It's going to be an introduction to fantasy. If you want a kid, whether it's your son, your daughter, your niece, your nephew, younger cousin, I have younger cousins, whatever, and you want them to get interested in fantasy, we want this to be an extremely accessible movie that's going to bring them into the fantasy genre. That's one fork. On the other hand, which is the one that I'm more interested in, like if you had asked me to adapt The Hobbit, the kind of a direction that I would have taken is, I remember the horror of this book. Really. I remember as a kid, like the goblins and Goblin Town and also the spiders and all of this. I remember oh my God, watching this and being like, how are they going to get out of this? Of course, I didn't really think this is hell, but when you're thinking about Goblin Town, you're thinking about all of this. I mean, like you're in a seriously dark place. And so the other way that I can see adapting this would be, and probably the direction that I would have initially taken if somebody just came to me, is like, okay, do you remember what you felt when you read The Hobbit or had The Hobbit read to you when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old? Okay, I'm about to put that on screen so that you can experience it again. And maybe that's not what you should do.
Well, I think there's an argument to be made that that's what Peter Jackson sort of attempted to do in part, not as intensely focused on the horror that you felt as a child, but because The Hobbit came after Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings in parts is dark fantasy, he tried to sort of read that into The Hobbit because it was going to audiences after Lord of the Rings. So there was an establishment of an expectation in Lord of the Rings. And so while I would argue that he failed in doing that, I think that that's the route that he attempted to take. So not to say, I'm not trying to diminish what you're saying. What I'm saying is that you're right? Like that is a path that you can take. And I think that was the path that Peter Jackson attempted to take with The Hobbit. He just kind of whiffed, right?
Well, I don't know about that, because I kind of think that what ended up being Peter Jackson's interpretation of The Hobbit ended up being a kind of third path, because there's a lot of humor to this, like what the Great Goblin looks like, and there's a lot of humor to this, because okay, so you're right, this is coming after the Lord of the Rings. So people who had just watched the Lord of the Rings film are expecting something that is just as grandiose. Okay, and The Hobbit is probably not that. So there's probably pressure to say, okay, so if you had done The Hobbit first, you could have done either path I was talking about probably.
Yes.
Then ended up with the amazing Lord of the Rings trilogy that we got.
Yes.
We have a problem here that this movie is being shot, the Hobbit is being adapted after the Lord of the Rings. So there are expectations coming from the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
That are probably not, it's probably not okay. Well, there's a word I'm looking for here, but that's probably not what, well, anyway, it's probably, that's not the right word, but it's probably not okay that you're expecting that out of The Hobbit, because you read The Hobbit and then you read Lord of the Rings, but you're going to watch the Lord of the Rings and then you're going to watch The Hobbit. So there are expectations that are put on you, which are probably not justified or something like that, but that's what's happening. So we have this impetus to make this a grandiose story, probably more grandiose than it had to be, but then also a whole bunch of humorous and childish elements. Radagast, I can't excuse. The Great Goblin. I did not go back and rewatch all of the movies before our conversation, but the reason I thought this would be a great conversation to have right now is because it's fresh on my mind, because I've been playing Hero Quest with my nephews and they are watching the movies.
Okay.
And so I hadn't watched the entire Hobbit trilogy all the way through, but I watched probably about half of it in the last few weeks, because after playing Hero Quest with them, they were like, hey, let's watch. They put it up on the projector outside. And so I would watch it. And so I was kind of refreshing my mind. About half of it was refreshed in my mind. So it's a good time to do that. So, and here, okay, so here's what, like when we were watching the Goblin Town scene, and we'll get into a bunch more detail, but like when we were watching the Goblin Town scene, my oldest nephew was like, these guys are the luckiest guys ever. That was what he said as we were watching it.
Yes, it's the too long Goblin Town scene that gets increasingly more ridiculous.
We're more ridiculous, right?
Yes.
And I'm like, I was thinking, if I were to adapt The Hobbit, you would never be thinking in the Goblin Town scene under the Misty Mountains, God, these guys are so lucky. I mean, this would be a horrific kind of thing for them to escape from.
Yeah.
And so they got a very different kind of look at this. We're about to talk about the production like that, but rather than a purely, like you're talking about, 90-minute introduction to fantasy for children, or a horrific kind of thing that invokes this is a weird third path to me.
Yeah, it's kind of like, but it kind of splits the difference and goes for both at the same time. I think you're right with that. Okay. I can see that. I just, the reason that I said that he was attempting, I guess what happened was, and this is speculation, is that he was trying to give the tone, the serious dark fantasy tone to The Hobbit that he had given to Lord of the Rings in the films. But he was also trying to recognize or indicate or point toward the fact that The Hobbit as a book is a very, well, I mean, it's look, I guess we come from a different era, but during our era, it was a very kid-friendly book, right? It was the way that you introduced kids to fantasy, except for me, apparently. But so he kind of tried to split the difference on it, and that, I mean, it was likely a major contributor to why this was not well received, right? Like even the fleeing on barrels scene is just like, how long is that in the book, right? They just escape in barrels. And that's the end of it. And now there's orcs, and it's just a whole big choreographed thing. It becomes absolutely over the top and ridiculous. Immediately shatters immersion. Immediately shatters your buy-in. But yeah.
Well, yeah, I know. That's sort of like as my nephews are watching it. Now, the interesting thing is that my youngest nephew is the one who's most absolutely like dialed into fantasy.
Oh, he loves it. He loves it.
The youngest nephew, right? He's like 8 years old. He just turned 8, so he's like 8 years old now. So I mean, he is dialed into fantasy, and I love playing with him and all that. But my brother and I were as they had the movie up on the projector and they were watching it. Like he and I were making fun of it, like under our breath behind it to one another, as we were watching. It's like, oh my God, what is going on here? And like that barrel out of bond scene. But the youngest nephew, even though he is the most dialed into fantasy, and he was even like, wait a minute, Thorin's father's alive? Then how is Thorin the prince? They're like, what? Shouldn't the father already be the king? And we had to explain that the king was lost. And all that. He is dialed into all of this. He thought, he was like, oh, the barrels out funny, and my brother was the barrels out of bond scene was funny, and my brother was like, well, my 8-year-old enjoyed that. Like that's where we were with this, and. If I had done it, it wouldn't be that way. So the Doc Flamingo for $5. Thank you very much, Doc. Doc says he half-assed it with the songs and silliness early on, which is just abandoned before the first movie was over.
That's very true.
The Hobbit when we talk about the Hobbit book, I mean, it's not a perfect book, but it's genre defining, and everything that it was. And that's why I really hope to talk with Brianna and Doug and actually do a deep dive into the Hobbit book. Because it's not a perfect book, but it is so genre defining, and it is so many people's introduction to the genre that there's so much to say about it, and there's so many reasons why it's here. Hey, PH, good evening.
Well, it's likely a collection of stories. Hey, PH.
Cassie, good evening. Cuddle Live, good evening, Cat. Good evening. And PH
it's likely a collection of stories that he told his kids when they were going to bed, right? Here's how Bilbo saved the dwarves from the spiders. Here's how Bilbo saved the dwarves from the goblins. Here, the movie kind of flows that way.
The movie kind of flows that way because, that's a critique of the literature when we talk about the book specifically, but that also influences our adaptation of it. That when I read this book as an adult, I'm like, these dwarves suck. Like they can't do anything.
Yeah, they're pretty bumbling.
They bumble into everything, and Bilbo has to get them out of it. So that is something that you have to address when you're talking about a modern adaptation. That how incompetent do these dwarves need to be on their way, to getting there? Because I don't think a literal page for page adaptation would be a good idea. Like there are things like that you have to deal with when you're like, what am I going to about to put on screen? Well, but anyway, I would have
page adaptations can be very difficult, right? Because they're different mediums. You can get away with things in books that you can't get away with on screen. You can get away with things on screen you can't get away with in a book. And so it becomes, you have to really kind of pick and choose. I think, for what it's worth, The Hobbit's probably an easier adaptation than most, or at least it should be, right? just like the first Harry Potter. Harry Potter gets more and more complicated as the books progress, but like the first one, pretty easy to adapt, right? And
Yep.
it became overblown and overcomplicated, and for what? Like, I love the movies, right? But like I said, there's a lot that I read into them. So, for example, these movies were coming out while I was still living in California with Candace. They were being released around the holiday times, and every time that they would release one in theaters, they had Denny's. I don't know if you have a Denny's near you, but Denny's had they had a very Hobbit themed menu that would come out every year like clockwork when the movies were released, right? And you could go and get your honey cake pancakes and your Hobbit whole breakfast, which was just like an egg fried and cracked inside of a piece of bread. But it was fun, and in a state where the seasons never change, it was something that I could look forward to in the winter around the holidays, that for at least a 3 to 5 year stretch, I don't quite remember how long it took them all to come out. It was something I could look forward to. It was a tradition that Candace and I had established. And so I really kind of took a fancy to the films. And so I really do enjoy them, but it's, again, I'm going to be honest about them. As far as films go, they're not great. I can certainly have fun with them. I always have fun with them. We own them. We try to watch them every year at around Christmas time because that's the tradition, right? So that's kind of where I come from with those movies. But there's quite a bit there that's not necessary. So
okay, we'll go into the production next. I was going to say one more thing, that as a child, like also my influences as fantasy as a child, I had several paintings, oil paintings, up in my room as a child, and one of them was immediately over my head, and the other one was to my left as I was laying in my bed. The one immediately over my head was an oil painting of the Battle of Mazarbul in Moria, which my uncle did. My
That's
uncle
awesome.
had done a painting of the Fellowship fighting the Uruk. There wasn't a troll in there; it was the Uruk and the Valin's tomb and stuff like that. And so that was what was over my bed as a child. But then over right to the left was a painting that he had done of Gandalf and Radagast walking through Mirkwood.
Oh, do you still have that painting?
I don't, but I hope he does. I'm going to go. I want to talk to him because I really want to get some of these paintings that he had done. And especially I would love if like Faded Edge, the RPG or something like that, like had like that at the cover or something like that. I want to talk to him about that. Like, that would be amazing.
I would love to see a photo of it. That sounds great. Radagast is my favorite wizard.
Yeah, well, see, but that's why, like, but that was a very serious painting of Gandalf and Radagast on the paths of Moria, and the brown wizard and whatever. And so that also definitely influenced my perception of Radagast. And so when I look at this movie and I'm like, Radagast is a joke, in this, I really wanted to see a serious Radagast.
I thought that the casting for Radagast was good, but the direction was not great.
Is weird. So okay, so let's talk about the production, because I sent and I posted this in the Discord and also at the very beginning of the chat in here, because Dax Rocker, who played Rob in The Cultist, had sent this to me when we were talking about The Hobbit. He was like, there's a behind the scenes like DVD extra about why The Hobbit is terrible, and so I put that in the Discord server and then also here in the comments. And you may want to, if you actually I have the link right here. I'm going to post it again. Peter Jackson winged The Hobbit.
It's such a good title.
And that's what it is. So if you might want to just pause this discussion and go watch this, because I had Bacon read this too. Because the Hobbit was in to watch that and then come in. The Hobbit was in production hell or pre-production hell for a long time, because there was some type of disagreement about the rights and things like that. But I remember at the time, this was long before I was live streaming, But at the time, I was like, there will be a Hobbit movie. I was telling people there will be a Hobbit movie because there's too much money on the table. Whoever's got to sort out the rights for this movie, eventually they're going to realize that some money is more money than no money.
Yes.
So they're going to get this movie made. And I was borne out by that they did eventually get figure out how to get this movie made and get the rights to whatever they had to figure out or whatever.
Yeah, the rights were they were a mystery for a really long while before Warner was finally able to work a deal out.
And so then Del Toro was going to come on and direct this. And so, and a lot of people were very interested in seeing what a Del Toro take on The Hobbit was going to be. I mean, that's who knows like that. But he basically, the story is that he soaked up 18 months of pre-production, being down in New Zealand, trying to whatever he was doing, and then for whatever reason, okay, no, I'm out. I'm not doing this. And
do we know what the reason was? I mean, it says directorial responsibility in the short vignette that you showed me, but it never actually clarifies what exactly pulled him away. And I don't recall, because obviously I was following the production of the films at the time, but I do not recall what the reason given was back then.
Let's ask Perplexity why. Oh, here we go. Why did Del Toro leave the production of the Hobbit movies? Let's see what Perplexity has to say. Perplexity says, Del Toro left the production of The Hobbit primarily due to prolonged delays and complications surrounding the film's development. Initially brought on board in 2008, Del Toro faced significant challenges that ultimately led to his departure in 2010. Ongoing delays, financial issues at MGM, conflicting schedules, creative vision, and direction.
Financial issues?
It says financial issues at MGM. This is Perplexity AI that's telling us. The production was significantly hampered by financial difficulties at MGM, which was undergoing bankruptcy proceedings. This instability delayed the greenlighting of the project, leaving Del Toro uncertain about the future of the film and concerned that all of his preparations might be wasted if the studio could not stabilize.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense than just financial difficulties.
It says that Del Toro's original commitment was for 3 years, but as delays mounted, he realized he could not dedicate an extended 6-year period to the project without jeopardizing other creative opportunities. He expressed that his mounting pressures of conflicting schedules overwhelmed him, leading to his decision to step back. So, okay, so whatever. So he was brought on board, and then, has to go back. Peter Jackson comes in and says, all right, I'll make this movie, but basically we got to start the time over. We're starting the clock over. And the studio told him no. The bottom line is told him no, you are still on Del Toro's schedule. And so he had to step in from the get-go 18 months behind.
That whole exchange is it's mind-boggling to me, because you would think that the reason that they're telling him no is to save money, right? They're pinching the purse strings closed because they don't want to go through all that again, because they just spent money on what I'm sure the studio viewed was perfectly good pre-production, be it, artwork or set design or wardrobing or concepting or site scouting, whatever it was that they had done. They thought that was good enough. And to be very honest with you, I mean, it likely was, right? They had spent good money on it and it was likely usable. And then Jackson came in, and I don't know what he scrapped, but we do know that there is talk of, at least in this video that we saw, about how Peter Jackson winged it. He was, several of the department heads were stating that it was kind of starting all over again for Peter Jackson. They did it once for Guillermo del Toro. They had to do it again for Peter Jackson with a drastically different vision of Middle Earth and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And so it ended up catching up with him in a very fatal kind of way.
And then Peter Jackson was sick for an extended period during what was the production, and
I think
so
they said 6 weeks, right? Like he was just not there for 6 weeks, and then even then, go ahead. I'm sorry, Heath.
Or like pneumonia or something.
Yeah, something like pneumonia, and then 6 weeks you're off, and then you come back and it's pneumonia, so you're not going to be 100% when you come back anyway. And the schedule that he was keeping was like 21 hours of shooting and 3 hours of sleep, and absolutely just like really ill-advised schedule keeping. But this was, I imagine, an effort of his to try and at least keep up if he couldn't get ahead of it.
And of course, and you were talking about an incredible amount of money that this movie cost.
$745 million for the Hobbit trilogy, as compared to $281 million for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So Fellowship of the Ring on its own was $93 million. And the Hobbit trilogy was it was an overblown budget. Additionally, if this is maybe going to help put things into perspective, the Hobbit is around 90,000 words, right?
Right.
Fellowship of the Ring is around double that, at 100 and around 100. It's like 189,000 words, 190,000 words, and they fit that all into one movie, right? And Dune, as a solid comparison to Fellowship of the Ring, also around that 190,000 word mark, and it's like 188,000 words. Fits very snugly into two films, and there's a lot that was changed. There's a lot that was omitted, and that's transfer. I mean, that's going back and forth between a medium. It happens, but fits very snugly in that two film sort of slot. The Hobbit at 90,000 words was decided to be 3 movies, and there just wasn't enough material to film all of that.
But $765 million like for this. It's
absurd. Absolutely.
You should have been like, okay, yes, let's give people. The fan base would have been there 18 months later. If you had to back this movie up, the fan base would have been there 18 months later, especially knowing Peter Jackson's coming back. Jackson's coming back. We're giving him another 18 months. Like, the fan base wouldn't have gone anywhere in 18 months. But then also, like, that film, that movie, or that video we were just talking about, Peter Jackson winging The Hobbit, that it was still, it seemed like to me from that he was still going for 2 movies, but that because the delays and whatever, and just his inability to even think about this, that eventually he was like, we're doing 3, because he was talking about how the script isn't even finished. Like, I don't have a script. I got whatever. So it eventually was like, okay, we're just shutting this down, and then we'll come back next year.
And I mean, I think that at least in viewing these clips that you showed us, the video that you showed us, it seemed like what the decision was attempting to do was, giving him breathing room, right? It's like, we're going to do 3 movies. So I have a whole other pre-production. I have a whole other film to put all of this stuff in so that I can finally get ahead of it. Unfortunately, what he didn't realize he was doing was creating an entirely new film that he needs to fill with a bunch of stuff that just isn't in the book.
So you should have given him that year on the front end.
Yes.
Just give him that year on the front end. And you said
it should have been on the front end.
Picture from that.
Oh yeah. It's an absolutely, and this is from that video. It's at the tail end of that same video. He winged it. And I noticed this as I was watching it. This is in a photo. This is Peter Jackson on The Hobbit. So he is sitting in Erebor, and it is larger. He's small in the frame. It is looming over him, just completely overwhelming him. I think it's a pretty great image as far as how he feels this particular film treated him. And it's very communicative in that regard.
And he hasn't been back to a franchise after that. Like,
no,
this kind of broke him, right?
Yeah,
this kind of broke him. So I mean, this is very disappointing on a lot of levels.
It is, because Lord of the Rings. I mean, there are, and as Sable said earlier in the in the chat that he thinks that it's a good trilogy for what they were, but he has problems even with them. Everyone has problems with them, right? Because it's not.
Well, no, he was talking about the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. So
okay.
with Lord of the Rings, it's, even though it has problems, can by some, and is by some, considered to be the best movie trilogy of all time, right? Some consider Star Wars, so but there is, Lord of the Rings is really in the running for that crown, right? It's in contention.
And Star Wars, well, to me, yeah, Star Wars is different because that's not an adaptation. You know, when you think about an adaptation, like,
right, sure, but
yeah,
the issue then becomes like, you know, here Peter Jackson is releasing this, what some consider to be the greatest movie trilogy of all time, doing another trilogy in a poor way that breaks him, and he never comes back, right? He's just kind of, I mean, I'm sure he still has millions and millions of dollars from being on these projects, so he's doing fine, but the fact that he hasn't really engaged a creative outlet since is sad. You know, I think we're probably all poorer for it, for not being able to experience the stories he would like to tell. He's an incredible visual storyteller. He made some bad decisions on this one. A lot of it had to do with, you know, the studio saying no, right? They didn't say no on the money, which is nuts to me. That's which is what, like,
clearly
had a lot earlier. It's like, how could they not give him 18 months up front, give him a whole other movie on the back end? It just it doesn't make any sense to me. It's so strange that they would say, no, we're pulling the strings on the purse tight for your 18 months up front. You have to resume at Guillermo del Toro's schedule or on his schedule. But then, yeah, we'll pay, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars for this third movie that you don't need on the back. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So I feel like Warner, I think it's Warner, they can certainly shoulder some of this blame.
Yeah, I think they do. Okay, so this makes me feel better because I was like, okay, so how is this conversation going to go with Bacon here? Because I was like,
oh, I love it.
It's so great. All that good. So, like,
no. So I am a firm. So I'm a firm believer in being honest about these things, right? Like, we had our conversation about Arcane, and I said that I love it. I genuinely love it, but I want to be honest about it. And so I can remove my enjoyment of a thing in order to be critical of it and see what lessons can be learned. And I'm not, you know, I never want to tear it down. I know what goes into making a movie. I've been on a film set before. You've been on a set before. You never really want to denigrate the people's hard work, because there's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of extenuating circumstances. There's a lot of creative problem solving, because a lot of things happen that you don't expect to happen. But there are lessons to be learned for sure. And so, you know, analyzing these and saying, well, in a perfect world, this is the decision that would have been made, or maybe he would have been given his 18 months up front. I think it's worth examining. And I'm going to be honest about it. I just also happen to love the movies. I love seeing Middle Earth, you know, visually. And I've even said this before, right? Like, I love the Lord of the Rings films and I love the Hobbit films, but I didn't need them, right? You only ever really need the novels. Like, those are the stories that Tolkien wrote. And he wrote them, at least those 4 stories, the 3 Lord of the Rings books, which I guess technically is one story, and the Hobbit, to completion. Like, they are complete stories. And you don't really need anything outside of that. It's fun to see how other people visualize those things. It's sort of validating to see someone have that same passion for you and put that much effort into it and put it on the screen and have it be as successful as it is, but it's not necessary. And so I'm going to be honest, and I will say, you know, that I love the Hobbit films and I love watching them, even while I'm watching them and I'm thinking to myself, this is awful green screen. Why did you do this? Why didn't you just go to a field and run through a field? Or, you know, what is up with the saturation and the bloom? Why was this not color corrected properly? Like, I can think all of those things at the same time while I'm just enjoying the living hell out of the movie.
And the weird super speed frame rate or something like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of weird stuff. There's a lot of just strange decisions that were made that make no sense. There's no real explanation for them. I don't think an explanation has been offered. But even still, I love them. I think that, you know, seeing Erebor in the fashion that Peter Jackson envisioned it is incredible. I love the Lake Town sets. I love the Lake Town sets. Yes, I love those sets. They just, I think they're just fantastic sets. I just really, really like them.
I think of when I watched The Lord of the Rings, it's one of the reasons I really like them is because it is 80 to 90% of what I envision in my mind.
Sure. Yes.
There are things that are not, and we'll talk about them later like that. But I mean, one of the really cool things is that the Lord of the Rings shows me really close to the kinds of things that and part of the reasons is because it was is because our visualization of those are based on certain artists who then worked on that, like on the movies and things like that.
I remember seeing Gondor for the first time on screen and going, that is Gondor. That is exactly what Gondor should look like. It was fantastic.
I didn't have that so much with The Hobbit. Lake Town was one of those. Erebor was one of those. The dwarves that from the Iron Hills and things like that. Radagast, his weird rabbit thing. I don't ever want to watch again.
The sled, you mean?
The rabbit sled thing that he's driving around on. We talked about the luck of Goblin Town. This is whatever, and the great goblin that looks comedic, and so I didn't have that same visual experience with The Hobbit personally.
Okay.
This something that The Hobbit is supposed to look like. It's most still in there when you're still in the Shire, to me, when you're doing the unexpected party, when you're okay, that's one of the things like that. I watched that with one of my nephews, the oldest nephews, earlier on. It's like, if I'm going to watch this movie, the depiction of the unexpected party, to me, you're still very much, but then you start to depart. I felt like now also like the dwarves. I don't like the comedic dwarves.
You like dour dwarves.
I would have given a much personally with
I
my
personally
approach,
prefer dour too.
I would have given a much more dour kind of dwarven approach to this. There is the issue that they can't all look the same. Like when you're moving to a visual medium. That you could make all 13 dwarves look the same, and that's not going to work. So that's one of the things that is the adaptation. I got to visually distinguish all of these dwarves, but I wouldn't have gone the route of I'm going to make them look comedic.
Yeah, some of them were a little too much. And some of them were like, what was with Keely, Feely, and Thorin? They were just pin up hot guys, right? Like what?
When you're talking about the fact that Thorin doesn't have a great beard.
Yeah.
Thorin doesn't have your beard, Bacon. You've got Thorin's beard.
I have a better beard than he does.
Right. You're right. The fact that that's the case. The fact that there are dwarves without beards at all.
Yeah.
And is bizarre. I would never have put that on screen, and not having Thorin have your beard, Bacon, is also a major issue.
I agree. I think that it just was. It was a little too. It was a little much, right? It was just a little much. They should have toned down the. It was almost like they were kind of comic book representations of what you would think a group of dwarves look like. And they just broke a lot of rules, and they defied the convention that was outset in the book. And look, I get it. You don't have a lot to go on in the book, right? But that Thorin has a beard.
Right.
Beard.
Yeah. So that would have that would have been a change and a departure from the book. We're going to have to make these dwarves more serious, so they're not always just bumbling into some stupid thing that Bilbo has to get them out of. So there would have. So yes, I'm not someone who said you've got to go page by page, or I'm not going to be happy, because I understand the issues with The Hobbit. This Doc Flamingo for $5. Thank you very much, Doc Flamingo. Says Jackson is naturally prone to goofy, cheesy action stuff. He was with the Lord of the Rings long enough to step back and tone it down. Yes, it was toned down, not so much here. Legless skateboarding. because there was some of that in Helm's Deep, and so Lord of the Rings movie elf stuff, right? Yeah. There wouldn't be any of that in my adaptation. Cheesy elf skateboarding stuff would not be there.
Yeah, me either. I agree with that. But at least in the Lord of the Rings, like Doc said, it was used very sparingly. But
yeah,
not so.
There was
in the
no
Hobbit.
reason for Legolas to be in this. Like oh my! But you're talking about dragging things out and stuff like that. Like as my brother and I are watching behind my nephew's, like, oh my God, here's Legolas, and we got this other the elf woman and a love story. Like, oh my God!
Like, yeah, there's like a love triangle, an unnecessary love triangle with a character that isn't even in the Hobbit, who is mentioned, I think, fleetingly briefly in the Silmarillion, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken though. But not it's just it's and from the moment she appears, that she's there to be a love interest for a dwarf. That's why she's there. That's the first scene that you see her in. I think she saves him from a spider, right? She hooks a knife in a spider's face and
surf in to save him.
Yeah.
Like, oh my!
And then
God.
and it just goes on from there. But it's I don't know. Like, there's just something about it, though. Like, I love Lee Pace as Thranduil. I really do like Armitage's Thorin. I think he really did a good Thorin. He needed a beard, right? And that's, as far as characterization goes, I think his character. Okay, so he's
I thought she was
completely fabricated.
I thought that was the case.
Yeah, which I mean, that's even worse, right? So let me. I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I mean, she was there to romance a dwarf, and that's just not a good enough reason to have a character in any film.
And Bjorn. I was having multiple thoughts at once. Bjorn is not at all what I would have thought. Bjorn. Like, when I think of Bjorn, that's not the kind of thing that I think of. But one thing that I was upset, like the stream in Mirkwood that causes you to lose your memory, they just skip over, and it's not there. And I even deliberately wrote a scene into a story I'm writing that we will get to eventually about the stream that causes you to lose your memory, just because I was so upset that they didn't do that in the Hobbit movies. And that was such an iconic thing that I remembered. Bomber, dropping into the stream and stuff like that. I was like, well, okay, well, if Peter Jackson can't do it, well, I'm going to return a stream that has that effort, or has that characteristic to it. So, it was things like that. They're like, okay, we can get a love story with a dwarf, but we can't even get the memory erasing stream. It was actually in there.
Yes, sure can. But here's this whole needless love triangle that means what? What does it mean by the time the story resolves? It doesn't mean anything, right? Like, okay, so her heart's hurt. All right. So she has some sort of relation to Thranduil. Okay. So what? What does it matter? How does it impact the story? How does it impact the theme? It doesn't. It's completely throwaway, which is a shame.
Has somebody done a recut of this? Like, they probably has.
Like, that's a great question. I don't know. I'd be interested.
That's actually a great question. Like fan re-edit of The Hobbit.
And I'll Jonathan here, Jonathan G94. Hello. Thank you for coming.
Oh, hi, Jonathan. Oh, yeah. Jonathan says,
I like Tauriel in spite of her being a fabricated character. I do too. And I think that Tauriel is a really strong case for how well Jackson understands Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, because he was able to fabricate a setting relevant character in a way that makes sense and fits appropriately into the world and in the culture. There's still flaws. It's not exactly perfect. Obviously, is not Tolkien, but I like her just the same.
Well, no, wait a minute.
Doc Flamingo says there's lots of recuts.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So, there, Doc Flamingo says, okay, so that's like this M4. Like, okay, so some people are calling this the M4 cut. M4, the Hobbit book edit. Is that one of the people are talking about like that? That the M4 book one right here took the extended cuts of the 3 films and cut them down to one cut in the same vein. So okay, so yeah, I feel like somebody would do that, trying to get this to something that was better. But
Yeah.
I still, so the interesting thing is also that we'll be around when The Hobbit enters the public domain,
Which is kind of exciting.
which is exciting, which means that we'll get to see alternate versions of The Hobbit.
For sure.
So the Hobbit, I mean, so The Hobbit, it's like next decade too. It's not even far away that we will get an opportunity. Like, so when does The Hobbit enter the public domain?
I think Batman is going to enter the public domain during our lifetime too. It's Mickey Mouse already has, or maybe it's Winnie the Pooh. It's Winnie the Pooh. I'm sorry. No, maybe Mickey has too.
No, Winnie the Pooh has, but also the earliest Mickey has.
Right. So Winnie the Pooh has, Mickey has, Batman will, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings will, which is really, that's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So in the United States, The Hobbit will enter the public domain in 2032. So I mean, like, that's imminent.
Yeah, that's less than a decade away.
Right. Which is 95 years after its publication. There's some other rules in different countries and things like that, whatever. But I mean, we're still looking at the imminent public domain release of The Hobbit, which means that we will get to, I mean, people are going to tackle this.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to see something. So it's not like, okay, this is what you got, and it's going to be locked up for another 100 years, and you'll be dead by the time somebody else decides to do this. So we're going to see this, which is extremely exciting to me.
Yes, I agree. Me too.
But what else is there to say? I mean, what are the great parts of this? Like when you're talking about, okay, yes, there's the personal aspect to it, but I mean, are there things that you think are done well that we?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's talk about those. Let's talk about those then. Okay, so what do you?
It's all the stuff from the book. I think that first of all, I think Bilbo's arc is great. Now, we kind of mentioned this earlier.
You were talking. No, I think we talked about. You were talking about Bilbo's arc before
backstage.
We started. Yeah.
Okay, so Bilbo's arc, which is a very unfortunate. It's a great arc. Okay, so Bilbo is every scene he's in, he steals, right, and he is really the highlight of this trilogy. However, his arc, he reaches the end of his arc at the end of the first film. And he doesn't change moving forward. So he's just kind of along for the ride. So while he is really exciting and outstanding in the first film, in the follow-up films, he becomes kind of just a bystander. Now, he is involved, and he does steal the show when he's in the scenes that he's in the subsequent films. For example, the scene with Smaug, I think, is an incredibly good scene where they're having their exchange, but it's lifted directly from the book. Right. So this is one of those scenes that makes it in from the book directly, beat for beat. And it's very, very successful. And I love seeing it. Now, there is unfortunate stuff with Smaug later on where, like, there are cuts of him that made it into the film, which is like kind of incomplete CG. But those parts aside, when he meets Smaug and has the conversation, really, really solid scene. It's one of my favorite scenes from the story, period. I think that the interaction with the dragon, it's world building. It's also great dialogue. It's also character building. It's just this great beast until he actually encounters it. And then it's a fiery intelligence. And it's understands, and it's working things out as it's having the conversation with him. So, like, I really do like that scene, and I think it's very, very successful in the film. I think Bard is great. I think that he's put in an unfortunate situation. I think that the mayor of Laketown, or maybe it's not
the master.
Yeah. The master of Laketown, and Alfred as comic relief, just an absolute travesty.
Okay, so that's bad. Okay,
but yes, but Bard in and of himself, I think his characterization is good. I think his casting was good. And I appreciate Jackson's attempt to give him a little bit more, to build him up a little bit better, because he is ultimately the one who slays Smaug. But degrees of success, right? Mostly unsuccessful, I would say. And then what else is good? I love Dane Ironfoot. I love Billy Connolly. I think that he was perfect casting for that role. I think that it not even like leans up against comic relief. I think it full on, like, both feet leaps over the line. But I think that at that particular moment in the film, it's appropriate because there's the tense battle, and then finally we see some sort of, aid on the horizon, and he shows up. And so with that release, the release of the tension and the buildup, comes a little bit of room for appropriate comedic relief. And I appreciate that. But so there really are some good bits. But it's, there's not a super ton. Insofar as, like, excellent filmmaking is concerned, or scene construction. I think the casting is great. Like, Martin Freeman as Bilbo is bang on exactly who should have been cast. And again, I think he steals every scene he's in. So virtually every scene that he filmed is just kind of a joy, at least for me, to watch. I see what you're saying there. Sable Phoenix only somewhat. They quoted the scene from book, but having Smaug wandering around the room and Bilbo dodging his feet is actually undercutting his power and menace. It's a visual medium, right? You can't just have the dragon hang out. It's got to be doing something. So they made it do something. So I can forgive that. It's easy to forgive.
But I think what I would have done, I think I would have made it smaller, because to me it's just so huge. The amount of gold that is in here.
Oh yeah.
It's just so, and the Smaug's, and he's like underneath all of the gold. Like, to me, it's just so over the top that, okay, yes, we need to have him Smaug do something. But I feel like if it were smaller in a sense, you could have given that dialogue something more, perhaps more meaning, if you weren't overwhelmed by the ridiculous scope of the setting that they are in.
I think I can agree with that. I think that that's a reasonable take, and I think that I probably would have enjoyed it more were it less ridiculous. And it's just, yeah.
The scene when you're talking about the comedy with Dane, one of the things when we talk about the book in general, okay, so we talked about how kind of ridiculous the dwarves are, which is an issue you have to deal with when adapting the book. That, okay, they don't really do a whole lot,
right?
But they are. So one legitimate area of adaptation, like, okay, then we're going to make them more comedic in the beginning, because they all get captured by this and they get captured by that and the whatever.
Yeah,
so
it's Bilbo saving from spiders, Bilbo saving from goblins. Yeah,
right, the spiders and the goblins and the spiders, and then, like, everything that they've got to be saved from, like chapter to chapter to chapter. So okay, so one interpretation is, okay, let's lean into the comedic nature of this. But then one of the things that happens, which is a shift in the tone of the book, is that by the time I thought Dane showed up, the dwarves become badasses. Like, when Dane shows up and it talks about how they are all armed and armored with their mail mesh and all of this. I mean, I wanted to see exactly that on screen. I wanted to see exactly how they were armored on screen. That by the time Dane, so even if you went with a more comedic dwarves prior to that point, there's a shift in tone with the dwarves at this point, where, because as you're telling this, it's a bedtime story or whatever. Okay, now at this point, they're badasses, and now we are about to enter battle when Dane shows up. And so I would have shifted at that point, even if I had done comedic dwarves up until that point. When Dane shows up, because I also did kind of like this is kind of an addition to the movie, but I did kind of like this, that why is Thorin only got these 13 guys anyway, whatever. But they kind of explained that in the movies by saying that, like, Thorin put out his call. Yes. And at the end of the day, only these 13 showed up. So I'm going. So I kind of like that, because that gives that excuse that, okay, this is a ragtag group we got whatever we got. I mean, we got Balin, who I really liked throughout.
I really love
film.
Balin. I thought that
I really
he was one of the best characterized dwarves, I think.
Yeah, and if we'd had Thor, so yeah, he was by far the best dwarf. So we have these that showed up. So if you had played that up, which was there, that okay, I put out my call and I wasn't taken seriously by most of the vast majority of the dwarf nobility out there, that I'm actually gonna do this. So I got these 13 kind of, or 12, because these 12 kind of jokesters, are going on. But then once they actually prove they can do something, when Dine or Dane, whichever one, shows up, okay, that's when the dwarf nobility has taken notice, So I would have played that up, I think. So I would have taken it. I don't want to say that I don't like the movie because it did not do what I would have done. You can do that.
No, but I don't think that's you're coming across that way at all. And I agree with you. I think that while I enjoyed what we got, I do think I mean, look, I say that I enjoyed what we got with Dane or Diane, but I also sort of understood that it is definitely comedic relief at a point where maybe even if it's appropriate, it's on the heels of everything that's come before it. We have 3 movies that came before it of just really poorly timed comedy and really nonsensical situations and made up characters. And so it kind of can land poorly. But I agree with you. Like, let's say we turn that on its head, right? So let's say that that's the moment that the movies start to take themselves seriously and everyone's armored up and it becomes like we
got a serious threat here.
That would be great. I think that would be a really great tonal shift. I think that it would be timed appropriately. And yeah, I agree with that. I think that could have been really great.
I love this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when we talk about the literature, but one of the several lines that I have remembered forever from the first time I was read The Hobbit, is this, again, Thorin hailed them in a loud voice. Who are you that comes armed for war to the gates of Thorin, son of Thrain, king under the mountain? To me, that's when it is serious. That's some serious stuff. And especially that they're backed up. There are only 13 of them in this mountain. Yeah. But Thorin is dead serious. And I've always remembered, who are you? And I have remembered that forever. Who are you that comes armed as if for war to my gate? Like, I mean, I love that so much. And that could be a tonal shift.
It could be
a tonal shift.
In fact, maybe should have been, right? I think that Connolly was good. He was perfectly cast regardless. But I think that having that shift and really kind of demarking that as the start of a very serious ending to the trilogy, film trilogy, could have been much more effective. And it certainly, and I think would have been received better instead of a lot of what we got. Because there's much criticism has been leveled against the Battle of the Five Armies and the way that it was given to us.
Because and it's of course it had to be because it was broken into 3 movies, and you're like, okay, it's almost like, can you do the climax of a movie in a whole movie? And arguably no. Like, maybe we can.
Yeah.
The answer to that was no, and it was not necessarily planned that way, as we had said. But Bilbo isn't even present for most of that. He wakes up later. When all this. So, and of course, I understand why. Okay, for a modern audience, as they say, you want to show the battle and whatever. But it actually occurred to me that it was very much what Doug was talking about when he was talking about disruptive story elements. The Battle of Five Armies is not something tactical and strategic that you understand.
No,
it is just a lot of people.
It's a chaotic convergence. Yeah, it's just absolute chaos.
And it was because of that. I mean, it was because of we saw that in this film when who played Circus, who played Gollum. Yeah, he was the assistant director, right?
Yes, he was Unit 2.
Yeah, Unit 2, and that so while Peter Jackson is gone, because he's sick and not there, they're just like, let's shoot like cool things, that
Yeah.
dwarves and orcs fighting each other, which becomes a whole bunch of the Battle of Five Armies, and also like at the orcs and dwarves at Moria and stuff.
Yes.
And that shows you that it doesn't work. And I hope Doug will use that as an example. We need to bring that up to him, that like, okay, let's just show cool things of these two groups fighting. It doesn't end up working.
Yeah, just showing cool things is not it's not a good way. It's not a good way to film.
Right.
Candace famously calls these movies "Running from Wargs with Dwarves" parts 1, 2, and 3.
Well, yeah, I know. Because
it's mostly right, because you're trying to fill out 3 movies, and it shouldn't be 3 movies, so it's running from Wargs with Dwarves.
The 13 birds and 5 fir trees.
Yes,
and okay. That scene takes forever.
It takes absolutely forever. Yes,
it takes forever. Thorin leaps off, and then that takes forever. Like when we were watching when my brother was, and I really wish that he had them all read the books before he had gone through the movies. But he was like it was funny that he thought it was only 2 movies. He was like, as you're saying, he was like, they could have done this in 1 movie if they had just gotten them out of the Shire. Like, please get them out of the Shire.
Yeah.
So, because they take a long time to get.
They
out
really
of the
do.
Shire.
Yeah.
And then again, they take a long time with the birds and 13 birds.
And then they take a long time with the barrels out of bond. They take a long time in Lake Town. They take a long time.
You're in Lake Town for a long time.
Yeah, for a really long time. I love the set, but it's a really long time, and not a whole lot's happening.
And not a whole lot's happening. And so he was like, God, they could have done this in 1 movie if they had just got him out of the Shire instead of 2. Because once we had finished the first movie, after we had finally finished that 13 birds and 5 fir trees scene that just went on and on and on, he was like, okay, what's the next movie? And that, as he was scrolling through, I guess it was Amazon or whatever, that's when he realized it was 3 movies. He was like, which one did he need to click on? He was like, oh my God, this is I was like, yeah, no, this is 3. This is 3.
Yeah, you're in for it, my guy.
Yeah. And so, they would watch like 45 minutes of it or an hour or something like that. And I would, not every night even. And I would still get text messages like from my brother, like, we are still not done with this.
Still
movie.
watching The Hobbit.
We are still trying to watch The Hobbit. So, well, what else, okay. So is there anything else that was good about it that we should talk about that is run out?
Objectively, I think we already mentioned casting. We don't have to go through all the casting decisions. I think objectively the casting was done well. Another place that we spend forever on is Mirkwood. And at what's the name? It's not Dol Guldur, is it?
About Dol Guldur?
Yeah, we spend way too long there, and it's not all in a single scene. So it's not like we're there forever. It's that we're there, and then we return there, and then we return there again, and then we return there again. It gets really very out of hand with that. And I know you just asked me what else is good, and
Dol Guldur was. I was going to ask you. I wanted to make sure that you didn't have something else on the good side. But Dol Guldur is mixed. I think I went to, because Dol Guldur was the next topic I was going to go to. So let's talk.
Oh, great segue then. Let's get to it.
Okay. So I was going to say when we're talking about adaptions, how are we going to adapt this movie or adapt this book? Gandalf does disappear, and he's not in the story for a while.
Yes,
and he does have a cool thing that he does go and do. So what do you do with that if you're trying to put it on screen?
Do you put it on screen?
Do you put it on screen? Is that what you asked?
Yeah, because there's Gandalf is a wizard. He's very powerful, and so kind of keeping him in the story and around is dangerous, right? Because he could just solve all the problems ostensibly. At least if we had seen The Hobbit first before The Lord of the Rings. But do we really need to see what he's doing? Do we really need that mystery taken from him? Right? I don't know if we do. I think that it would be neat to see what he does, but I think that we have to really seriously consider the question, do we really need to take that mystery from that character in this moment? And we might not have to.
Right. So clearly Tolkien thought no. Because so that we do not need to see that.
Correct.
But also, Gandalf is this extremely powerful character. He saves them from the trolls.
Yep.
And then also he comes in, which is also one of the memories that I have, that exact same thing that appears in my mind when he comes in and he slays the great goblin. Gandalf appears back, and Glamdring glows, and he takes out so he does that a few times for them. Well, and he also he does this naming the lighting the pine cones on fire.
Oh, yes,
getting them away from the so he does that a few times. So obviously at some point Tolkien was like, okay, I'm going to get this wizard out of here.
Yeah, he solves too many problems. We got to get him out of here.
So the wizard's getting out of here. But then I do also understand from the adaption perspective, and what I'll say this term again, the modern audience or whatever is expecting, or especially in the context of the mythology of the Lord of the Rings, especially if you're following the Lord of the Rings, as with the Hobbit instead of that. Okay, this is something cool that he goes and does, and he rides away. I can see an argument from saying, okay, let's put this on screen. Let's acknowledge, let's not just have him ride back in, when the clouds burst and all of a sudden Gandalf's back in the middle of them. And then he gives a line or two about, well, I had some other things I had to do. Let's not do that, because that does seem like I'm just getting rid of this character.
It does. But I mean, I think you can really make the case in either direction, right? And I don't think that it's a decision that should be made lightly. And I think that like I said, you should really weigh whether or not you're taking the mystery. If you are going to take the mystery away from that character, because that's a part of his power, right? Is his mystery. He's mysterious. If you are going to take that away from him, then it should be for a very good reason, and it should amount to something. I don't know if it amounted to anything in The Hobbit.
Right. So the other thing to think about, which I would be if I was like plotting this out for a script, like what do we need to show and what do we not, oftentimes showing something does diminish it. And we got lots of examples of that in pop culture and franchises and whatever, like Boba Fett, that you can see something and it can be really detrimental to the character.
Yes. So
we got something really cool. Gandalf going to Dol Guldur and encountering the necromancer, Sauron. And part of me is like I said, I'm still wrestling with my first draft or an outline of the script. What are we going to show? What are we not going to show? This can be a cool thing. But on the other hand, if we show it, is it going to diminish it? Now, I'll give you an example of where it doesn't.
Okay, because I'm going to give you an example where it does. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would say it can be done. Like it can be done.
I agree.
So let me give you an example of when it can be done. Is that when we are told in the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf says that regarding Saruman, that I strove with him. Okay, so Peter Jackson did take us to the Tower of Orthanc and show us the conflict between Gandalf and Saruman, which I think was extremely effective. And that was a big risk. I mean, in retrospect, that's a big risk. That's like, what is the confrontation between Gandalf and Saruman? And yet it was done very well. I would say like that captured all of the gravitas. What I saw on screen captured all the gravitas and the weight of Gandalf being delayed and his word, I strove with him. Arguably, it doesn't do that in The Hobbit. Like showing, right. Okay, so go ahead.
And that would be my example of where it doesn't, right? So the idea is that he's leaving and you don't know what he does, and he returns at a later time. But when he leaves and we follow him, and we see that he's really been imprisoned and he's being tortured, and then he has to be rescued. That's not worth removing his mystery, the part of his power contained in his mystery. It's not worth removing that for. On top of that, it diminishes Galadriel, which I don't like. Galadriel is my favorite character in all of Lord of the Rings because of what she represents. I think that her world weariness is very important by the time that we get to her in Lord of the Rings, because all she has done is sort of stood by and watched things happen. She had brothers taken from her, a father, there were wars that were happening around her. And while she did have her own ambitions to have her own kingdom, she is the singular entity in the entire cosmology that Sauron fears. And he fears her so much he actively avoids her. Allowing that confrontation to happen on screen for the sake of member berries, right? It was just, oh, remember when she got really angry in Lord of the Rings and kind of puffed up and got glowy? Oh, we can do that here too.
Right, yeah.
So not worth it. Absolutely not worth it. So it's a double whammy, right? So we see the mystery of what Gandalf was doing and how he was, traveling and where he was going completely diminished, and he was made to suffer on screen, be imprisoned. It really diminished the mystery and the power as a result of the character. And then on top of that, we also have this diminishment of Galadriel through this confrontation with Sauron that we did not need. It is not in the Hobbit story. Sauron never shows up in the Hobbit, if I recall correctly. I just, these particular scenes, I would prefer to have not, like, even beyond the mischaracterization of Radagast, who is my favorite of the wizards, even beyond the silliness in the barrels out of Bond, even the staying too long in virtually everywhere we visit, beyond all of that.
Staying too long in virtually everywhere.
Yeah, staying way too long in virtually everywhere we visit. I really, really, like, if I'm editing this movie, the very first thing that I'm removing is Dol Guldur. It doesn't need to be there. We get it. Like, we've seen the Lord of the Rings at this point. We know what this world is building to. We know the conflict. We know the confrontation. We know the difficulties. We know the hardships. We know the evil that is going to be visited upon this world. I do not need this scene. I do not want this scene. It undermines everyone who appears in this scene is undermined, or in these scenes, I should say, is undermined by them, and I would remove those first. They need to get out of here. They are my biggest lament of the Hobbit films are these scenes, because they just are so. They're not even like bad scenes, right? They're not filmed poorly. They're not acted poorly. It's just to the universe, to the world, and to the characters. It is just so detrimental. They should not be there, and they were a very foolish choice to include. I feel very passionate about this. I'm sure you could tell. These are the first scenes that would be cut.
That would go.
They don't need to be there. I do not like them there. It diminishes everyone who appears in them. There's just no need.
Yeah. And then we need Bilbo's. So if you're building this story around Bilbo, like you build the movie around Bilbo, then his arc needs to finish at the end of however many movies you've got.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, at the end of the story, that needs to conclude his arc. And
Yes.
It is kind of a weird thing, because I remember, and I'm sure I will talk about this again when we talk about specifically the books, I do remember being very upset that Bilbo did not kill Smaug.
Oh, yes. Yep.
I remember being extremely upset about that.
I remember being upset about that too. And again, my experience was not the same. It wasn't, it was Rankin and Bass for me first before it was the book. So I had a different experience, but I do recall, Bard getting up there and firing off the black arrow and a completely different interpretation, right? Like it's almost like a mystical sort of an
right. Yeah,
item,
the
right?
black arrow. Yeah, I know. I don't like the idea of the dwarven wind lance.
Right.
He's
Like,
actually got ballista. I hate
it demystifies
that. I mean,
it shouldn't be demystified. Yes. Yes. And that's how it should be in my view. So I feel like Rankin and Bass got that right, and Peter Jackson interpreted that incorrectly. But it's like, I guess I understand the decision. I still hate the decision though.
Well,
but I agree. It's even though there's like, without creating too much dead air, I'm going to just end with, I agree with you. Like, I think that Bilbo should have killed Smaug. I get it.
Well,
and I that's the way the story goes. I do like Bard. I do like the whole, the mystic black arrow, the sort of, is it magical? Where did it come from? No one really knows. It's the last one. And
right.
so I agree with you on all counts with regard to that.
Well,
I feel like, Bilbo should have done it.
I don't know. Well, I understand why Bilbo didn't, like with the black arrow.
Yes.
We had fiberglass longbows as kids. That
Ooh.
in the time, whatever. So we had fiberglass. So my brother and I would sometimes, when we were very young, would go out and we would shoot these longbows in the yard, like across the yard and into like the yard, and set up boxes and things like that.
Oh, that's right.
And my brother was probably too young for that, but he didn't know that he was too young, so he would go out and shoot anyway. So we would just go out and we would shoot these fiberglass longbows, and we spray painted one of our. My brother had got us some arrows from the whatever sports store or whatever. The Target arrows and stuff like that. But because of the Hobbit, we spray painted one arrow each black.
That's awesome.
And that was always the last arrow that we shot.
Of course, it's the last one.
Black arrow that
That's awesome. Volley, I love that.
The black arrow was the last one that went across the yard because
I love that.
Hey, that's even though I was like, okay, but actually, I understand. Okay, so actually, when you're talking about Bilbo's arc, you could what is Bilbo's arc? And especially if you're trying to build this out for a story, you're for a movie. We said that like when Bilbo gets his gumption together and goes to help Thorin in the way too long 13 birds and 5 fir trees.
Yes.
Scene at the end of movie 1. That's basically Bilbo's transformation.
Yes, that is Bilbo's transformation. He becomes
so we've got to put that transformation someplace else.
Yep.
Much further in. But if it's not going to be the death of Smaug, because like you said, because I remember my mother explaining to me, like, Bilbo's just a little hobbit, like he can't kill this dragon. Okay,
he's just a little guy.
So fair enough. But his death is not. So the end of the story has to be the end of Bilbo's arc, and so the Bilbo's arc should be him deciding to take control of the Arkenstone and solving the war.
Yeah, that's it.
Bilbo.
That could be it.
So that's it. So Smaug's death is going to come earlier in this film, but you're going to realize that that's not the end of the story because it's not the end of Bilbo's arc. That Bilbo doesn't come into his own to actually solve a problem where everybody's about to kill each other,
right? Until
he goes over the wall with the Arkenstone to take agency in the story, on his own. Yeah, I think that's how because I would not write the movie so that Bilbo kills Smaug because that's not what happens.
Right.
So I would write the movie so that that's Bilbo's climax.
Yeah, it's more of a sort of a shifting of importance placed on specific events than it is a complete rewrite, right? Which is unfortunately the problem that Jackson ran up against. He was really in full rewrite territory by the time that these movies were finished.
So the dwarves from a physical perspective, we're talking about the physical and the spiritual layers or whatever. We got this physical layer conflict of the dwarves, and they got this dragon in their home.
Yes,
but that's not Bilbo's internal struggle.
No.
So so they're not lining up perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that could be why Bilbo isn't present for a whole lot of that battle, because once Bilbo makes his decision about I'm going to give the Arkenstone to these people, and then there is also this physical layer of the battle but Bilbo's story is resolved at that time.
Yes, it's completely resolved at that point. Yes, before that point.
Yeah. And then you get the reconciliation between him and Thorin on Thorin's deathbed and things like that. So, yeah, I was wondering, we talk about a lot of conflict that goes on in geekdom today about all of our franchises and so forth. We're talking about IP rights and who owns what, which we'll be talking about tomorrow too. When we talk about Elon Musk and on the Geekverse tomorrow at Heath's Geekverse channel at 9:30 in the morning on a different channel, Heath's Geekverse. I've actually wondered if the Romans or Greeks had this problem, because it's probably not a problem that the Romans or Greeks had.
Probably not.
Because it would be interesting to know. Somebody probably knows what's the reaction to Virgil's work, or what's the in the Roman Empire or something like that. But they probably didn't have the situation where they might have had geeks who were like, "Oh my God, did you see what Virgil wrote? The whatever. I did not like this part of this." I mean, people are people, so they might have had those exact same confrontations. But
yeah,
it's
that's
not
true.
So they might have, but it's not like Virgil had the same kind of ownership over the Roman/Greek pantheon and the Trojan Wars.
Correct.
Because
that's all. Yes, it's all an externalization of the the cultural zeitgeist, and I feel like in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, if you read something that you didn't like, you said, "Oh, I can't believe Virgil wrote this," you would just write something of your own that would absolutely smear him, right? Like, that's how they handled it.
Or you're like, "Oh, no way. Oh, my God. What was Poseidon? You think Poseidon did that?" Hold on. There's nothing that stops you from just writing your own poem. It's like, no. It's like this. Let me tell you.
I feel like that's kind of how they would have handled it. And so, unfortunately, in a modern setting with IP and rights regarding IP and ownership and whatnot, we don't necessarily have that opportunity to be as direct about it until things fall into public domain, which will be in the next
it even like that's been brought up in the comments that sometimes that's not exactly so clear and whatever. But in general, there should be the idea that it'll fall into the public domain eventually, and then everybody can have at it. I was going someplace with that. Well, no, I was talking to somebody.
I interrupted you. I apologize. I didn't mean to.
Well, no. The thought wasn't. I was talking to someone. It may have been Wild Barley. We were talking about that, like new things. Okay, do we create new things, new stories? And I was thinking, and we were talking specifically about like Greco-Roman gods and these kind of stories. But I got to thinking, we do things like The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, the Marvel movies. Or before that, the comic books, all of that, that is modern mythology. That is something that has been given to the world that is modern. You're talking about the last 100 years or whatever that's been given, but it's different because of the legal aspects. Like when I was thinking about the like the Trevi Fountain, with all that kind of stuff, like building something like that like if I really want to, I can't just go to the middle of the city and be like, "Hey, we need some space here. I'm going to celebrate Marvel," and just start building all of the Marvel characters inside this gigantic and amazing fountain for people to enjoy. Or I can't build Bilbo and Thorin and Gandalf and things like that because they're owned by somebody. I can't.
Because unfortunately, culture's been commoditized, and you can buy and sell it, right? Like it's no longer a matter of, myth.
Yeah.
Which is to say, Jung's interpretation of myth and how it's the externalization and crossing the veil of, it's a unified sort of communal participatory thing. We can't do that anymore because people own Spider-Man.
Yeah. So it's different that we do create stuff, and that this has been something that all of those stories and things like that are really important. I think it's been given to the world, but they're not the property of humanity the way that the Romans probably understood Zeus and Poseidon and all of that that are there. Which I think is something to think about because I hadn't really heard that discussed before. Maybe it has been. There's no.
I think that it's for sure something to think about.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's been discussed somewhere, but I think that it would be a very interesting conversation on the Geekverse to hear what your take or Doug's take or Sable's take or Brianna's take is. I think that would be a very interesting conversation.
Well, is there anything else we should discuss about the Hobbit movies or their adaptations and?
I think we've kind of hit the wall on it, but I will reiterate that I do actually love these movies, right? Like this isn't a hate fest. I'm not being overly critical because I hate them, because they wronged me or they wronged Tolkien, or I just think that There were some poor decisions made. I'm very happy to have received them. I don't need any more Lord of the Rings on film, though. Like, I don't need the Rings of Power. I don't need whatever this Rohan thing that is coming up is. I don't need the Golem. I don't need any of that. I'm happy to have what I have and go no further with it because I think the writing was maybe on the wall with The Hobbit, but I do love them. And there's a tradition that we have to watch them annually, even though they're bad. I like a lot of bad stuff, right? I like a lot of bad stuff, but it's, I can at least be honest about it. So I think that, there's a lot of poor decisions. There's a lot that we can learn from, right? Like, if you're bringing in a new director, do not chop 18 months of his prep off. It's cutting him off at the legs. Like, just don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I hated to hear when you're watching that video that I linked to in the Discord and up in the comments, like the head of Weta, I guess, their props department. It's like, the amount of care that was put into the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Even with the props and how things look, like I was saying, that most of the time, like 80% of the time to 90%, I can tell you what I don't like about the look of Lord of the Rings. But for the most part, so they got this look, and that also obviously really, really cared about the armor, and all of this is put on screen.
All the props finished like a year before filming started.
This was all done a year before, and then they're talking about like we're like trying to dry the paint on stuff as we're shuffling it to the. That's not taking the same amount of care, and it shows when you don't have that same amount of care. That's like, so what are we actually putting on screen? And that's
a completely different situation for your prop master too, right? For you to have everything on set and ready to go when it's called for, or for you to be mad dashing trying to deliver things the day that they're going to be using them on film. It's just a completely different situation, and I understand the frustration, and it's just. It's disheartening to hear. That makes perfect sense in the context of The Hobbit and the end result. But
I mean, it's disheartening because these things only get done once. I mean, generally speaking, public domain aside and whatever. But I mean, like people only spend $720 million on something once. Like, I mean, that's not something like okay, we're doing this now. And so if it's not done well, when something this massive is being done, it hurts.
Yeah, well, it's film is like Peter Jackson's Hobbit is going to be Peter Jackson's Hobbit forever. This is it. This is what we got. Peter Jackson's The Hobbit forever. Additionally, like, film, it is an industry. Films do have to make money, right? But it's also storytelling that should be eliciting an emotional response in your audience. So the business is emotion and money, and you can't sacrifice one for the other. You can't say, okay, I'm going to go all in on emotion, because that generally doesn't work. You're not going to make any money. You're never going to be able to continue making your films. But at the same time, you can't go all in on just a buck, because you're going to end up making decisions like this and hastening things and, adding an entirely separate third film to
could we get people
ahead of it
instead of two, right?
Right. Like I understand the decision that he made or why he made it, but it just had the opposite effect that he desired. He was trying to give himself more time, and he ended up giving himself more space to fill, and it defeated him in the end.
Let me ask you this, based on a comment that you had, like that. This might be a good place to wind up, but I think it's an important question that we hadn't necessarily addressed, but I think is so important. How do we know when to stop? And can we stop in today's world?
You mean
like continuing a franchise far beyond what it should be? Because it's very difficult in a corporate environment, especially let's say a corporate environment where you have shareholders, because you can have a corporate environment where it's just owned by one person or a small number of people. You can have that, but let's say where you're responsible to shareholders and whatever, and they're talking about the next quarter and the next quarter and the next quarter, and what do we own? What can we do with it? They're going to want to keep producing things, and so once one of these great IPs that is like we're talking about approaching mythological status, in our society, but it's still owned by somebody, like Lord of the Rings, like some superhero elements. I mean, maybe even Harry Potter, whatever. And we don't know when to stop, because a publicly traded corporation is not going to just stop.
Well, here's the thing with that, though, like with regard to film, our current day Hollywood, which has been completely changed by the success of Marvel. Well, it's the same industry that gave us Chinatown. It's the same industry that gave us A Few Good Men, or Raging Bull, or A Miracle on 34th Street. Like, these are all self-contained individual films. You don't need to go past them. And I feel like that's really what Hollywood needs to get back to. It needs to get back to the spec script. It needs to get back to telling original stories that might be one-off, that you maybe can't bank on forever, but that's the point. You bank on the next spec script. And I get it. It's speculative, right? But Hollywood was doing absolutely fine as an entertainment industry, as a monument to entertainment, for a very, very long time, before we got to the point where Marvel entered and they had a decade-long, very successful run, but it really changed the face of the Hollywood executive, the Hollywood studio, and the Hollywood movie maker in general, right? And I think that it's possible to move forward, because you can never move back. That's a mind trap. You're never going to be able to go backwards in time. But I think that it is possible to move forward into these types of films. A24 is a studio that's doing it right now. They've done Midsommar. They've done Ghost Story. They've done The Green Knight. There are studios out there that are doing this, and A24 is extremely successful. Their budget has been increasing year over year. Their profits have been increasing year over year. They are on the up and up. Directors like Eggers, who's done The Lighthouse and The Northman, and he's going to be releasing Nosferatu on the 24th of this month, so for Christmas, which I'm super excited for.
I'm excited about that too.
There are ways to get back to it. And when I say back, I don't mean, we're not traveling back in time. We just have to really kind of recognize that the time for that Marvel continuity, it's past, right? Because they've beat it to death. There's no longer banking on it as much as you would hope. Like, Rings of Power was an absolute failure. They spent so much money on that, and now it's kind of floundering. Who knows if it's going to get a third season? Personally, I hope it doesn't. But it's not. Something has to change, right? And a lot of times people are going to view that as like, well, that's a downgrade. You're downsizing, and you can't really do that because, like you said, shareholders and corporate responsibilities and whatnot. But you don't have to downsize. You just have to diversify, right? Stop putting all your money into a Marvel movie and get 5 smaller films made that could maybe, run away on the budgets that you give them. You just have to be really picky and choosy about it. Like I said, A24 is absolutely hitting it out of the park. They are 100% nailing it down. Eggers nailing it down. And I think that, there's something to be said for that. And I think that if we can make a grand shift in that direction, who knows if we will. Hollywood is a notoriously cumbersome, sluggish beast to steer in any direction. But if we can get there, then I think that we'll start seeing a sort of a reinvigoration of the industry.
That would be nice. Like when you're talking about something like A Few Good Men, like what I think about with the contrast there is that there's a difference between saying, because if you have a one-off story like that, I love A Few Good Men. You have a one-off story.
Movie.
But what the continuity there is, we got a Tom Cruise film.
Yeah. Sure.
Let's put Tom Cruise. So the continuity and what we need to keep going is, Few Good Men is done. Get Tom Cruise another script. Like, let's put him. So the continuity is Tom Cruise, but
yes,
we're beyond the point of continuity of actors. Like, I mean, that like
true.
2 decades past that now continuity is, it's got to be this franchise brand.
Well, continuity, I think, there's still a measure of continuity in the director, right? People will still go and see a movie for the director.
There is still some of that. Yes.
So there's still continuity there. I think we've exhausted continuity of actor, and I think we've definitely exhausted continuity of sequel, right? Like, no one cares who Batman is. They'll go and see a Batman movie. Maybe not anymore. So that's the continuity of the film, is that I don't care if it's George Clooney or Val Kilmer or whoever ends up stepping into the role, Pattinson, whoever, people are going to go see the Batman movie. That's probably not the case anymore. So we've exhausted that kind of continuity. We've definitely, like years ago, I'd say decades ago, we exhausted the continuity of the actor. Directors are still there.
Directors are still there, even though Ridley Scott is trying really, really hard.
Oh, God.
Trying really, really hard.
He's really trying
hard.
We don't need He's absolutely trying hard to undermine his own damn self. So there is a continuity of director, and there is a kind of emerging continuity of studio, like I mentioned with A24. And there are other what are traditionally thought of as art house studios.
Get out here. This is an A24 film.
Yeah. And they are, their budgets are constantly increasing and people are seeking to work with them. So I really think that there is something. Hollywood is very well practiced at reinventing itself. We're never going to not have movies, right? It's just going to change over time. And I think that we're maybe seeing a ground level, maybe nothing comes of it, but I think we're seeing a sort of adjustment being made with regard to continuity of director and also specifically studio. So we will see. I love movies. I always say I come from movies because I do, and I think that we'll be okay. I think that there's going to be growing pains, right? But I think that we're going to be okay in the long run.
Well, I hope so, because I don't like seeing things that I care about beat into the ground. Like, I don't want to watch the Middle Earth beat into the ground. I don't want to watch Star Wars beat into the ground.
Yep.
I don't want to watch these things that Star Trek. I don't want to watch all these things beat into the ground. And that's, I guess there's a natural limit on the actor because eventually they die or retire. Like,
yes,
you can only do so many Sean Connery films. Like, Sean Connery is going to bring people to the movie theater, but eventually Sean Connery's like, all right, I'm done, or he dies. The same way will be the case with Tom Cruise, which is like our last movie star.
The same thing would be the case with directors as well, right? There are people they die too, but with a studio, if you can inculcate a culture and you can pass that culture on in perpetuity to whoever the next person in line is, I think we kind of have a shot.
That maybe it's the studio. Because my point was that the IP of the Lord of the Rings or Middle Earth or whatever it actually, that doesn't die like an actor or a director or retire.
No, it's forever.
You can keep beating that horse for as long as you want to beat it and you think there's money to get out of it. And that's not good. Like, I mean, I don't think it. I mean, I don't know anything about the Rohan thing that's coming out. I haven't actually not looked at it at all, other than seeing like a still. But
I only know it's coming out. I know nothing else other than that. I know I don't need it.
the Rings of Power. Yeah, I tried to watch that. Like that. I don't need to constantly have stuff reinvented for these things, which I understand a studio and executive wants. Like, people want Middle Earth. Let's do it. Can you think of anything else? Is there anything else we got that we can put in Middle Earth? Let's do it. And that's not good. Well, I suppose that will come up when we're talking about tomorrow, which is the importance of actually IP ownership and who gets to do that. TSO Frumman, like I said, so we do not know. I have no idea. I'm gonna have to.
I have no idea. Other than that, like I said, I just don't need it. If it's if it's good, if I hear that it's good from people whose opinions that I trust regarding film, I'll consider seeing it. But I don't need it.
Oh, it's a film?
That's what he says, right? Interesting. They're going with an animated cinematography and a theatrical release.
Oh, in December. Oh, like now. This says December 13th, 2024.
That is.
Oh. Well, I didn't even.
That's less than 2 weeks away.
I didn't even know that, man. It has not even been on my radar then. Like as far as my feeds and things like that, it has not. Whoa. So like actually, Nosferatu has been on my radar more than that because I was like,
I have such high hopes for Nosferatu.
Yeah, I know. I was like, okay, I need to contact people because we need to do a table talk on Nosferatu. We need to go and see that and then talk.
I mean, even the trailers that have been released up to this point have had such good decision making in how they've decided to keep things from the audience. And I mean, I know it's not, but the whole, like, even when I remember it, right? So I'm remembering watching the trailer. I'm remembering it in a sepia tone. I'm pretty sure the trailer there's no sepia in the trailer. They didn't film it on actual film, and I'm pretty sure there's no filter. I'm just remembering it that way. That's how effective it's been and how good the decision-making has been with those trailers. I have such high hopes for that movie. I'm really, really excited to go and see it.
Well, who knows? I might have to look at the writer of him. I don't know. So, all right. So that'll be something to think about because I was thinking about. I was asking the other night about like other things to talk about here that are current because we got other things that are earlier to talk about. We're going to be talking about things like Gilgamesh and you and I are going to talk about Beowulf next year. Yes. Things like that. So we're going to be talking about. I don't know. Are those even the classics? The classics, things like Beowulf and
they're classics.
The classics, does that sufficiently give them their weight? We're not talking about the classics as in like 1600s. We're talking about the classics as in going back to the year. But so that's all right.
We're talking about classic literature, capital C. Classics, lowercase c. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this was a great discussion.
I loved it. This was awesome.
So this was great. So I really enjoyed the direction that it went because I was like, oh my God, am I going to be sitting here talking with Bacon about? And he's even talking about like how amazing every part of this is.
No way.
Oh my God, are you serious? These rabbits that he's riding around on. Like
no. On the one hand, I'm not interested in shooting through my credibility like that, and on the other hand, I don't want to be dishonest. You know what I mean? I think that it's there are lessons to learn in the failures. And I don't say failures to criticize. It's just, sometimes you do your best and you fail. That is not weakness. That is life, as one Jean-Luc Picard would tell you.
All right. So your channel. So visit your channel, Better with Bacon for RPGs and movies.
Yes,
and
please.
Then also Heath's Geekverse. That's the channel. Tomorrow, The Morning Grind, we'll be talking about Elon Musk and Hasbro and everything that's been going on there. We'll do that at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow on the Heath's Geekverse channel. All right. Thank you so much for being here, James. And also thank you to everybody who's watching live and also to everyone who's going to catch up on replay. Thank you so much for being here. It's been fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Heath.
Later, everybody. See you in the morning.